Welcome. Good afternoon and good morning to those joining us out west. I'm Karen Langdon with the National Emergency Management Association. Welcome to the NEMA Empowerment e-learning series. We're very excited to showcase the expertise of some of our members in this series, and today we're happy to present Policy in Action, Hurricane Ian, and FEMA's new $1 million threshold. And a big thank you to AC Disaster Consulting for bringing us today's topic. Thank you again for being with us today. Now it's my pleasure to pass the session to Molly Bardman, Deputy Director of Recovery for AC Disaster Consulting. Welcome, Molly. The platform is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just so excited to be here this afternoon. It truly is an honor and a privilege to be a part of this presentation today. We're going to be walking through kind of a new policy topic, but first and foremost, I do want to introduce who's joining me today. I have Director Kevin Guthrie from the Florida Division of Emergency Management, and I have Lucas Pagan, Director of Recovery with AC Disaster Consulting. Next slide, Karen. So today we do have an agenda, but more than anything, the three of us really want this to be a facilitated discussion. So please utilize the chat. I'm going to be monitoring it, as is Karen, and we want it to be really engaging. Obviously, in a virtual forum, this can be a little bit more difficult than a face-to-face discussion. But that's what this is. This is a policy change, policy truly in action. So some of this is going to be us wanting to hear what you guys are experiencing, the questions that you guys have, any concerns you have, any wins you have. But today we will be going over the history of the public assistance threshold. There might be some people in the room that aren't as familiar with the public assistance program. So we're going to just start there. We're going to set a baseline. We're going to talk about how Florida has implemented state level administrative requirements within the context of this policy change. And then lastly, just discuss firsthand challenges, some stuff we're seeing out there in the field. We're about 9 months into this policy change. And so we're going to just talk about a couple, not necessarily case studies, but definite trends that we're seeing. But some of that last part, we are really going to rely on you guys. So start thinking through what questions you have, go into the chat and start introducing yourself. I'd love to hear a little bit more about who is in the chat. And you can go to the next slide, Karen, that would be great. Our goals for you are pretty simple. It's just understanding the risks and the rewards of this threshold. It's a big policy change within the PA program. And even prior to it coming into play, we were having a lot of these same discussions. So just understanding the challenges, but alternatively, the risks and the rewards. Understanding the compliance requirements that still do come into play at all levels. A lot of that is going to be Director Guthrie highlighting how Florida has specifically addressed it. And then lastly, the actions you can take to prepare for your next event with the threshold in mind. Some of you on the call might not have a disaster yet, and we'll actually show a map that the states that have had a declared event in the context of the new policy. But for those of you in the states that haven't had a declared presidential declaration yet, start thinking. Hopefully this is going to get you guys thinking about how it might impact you and your communities. Next slide. Okay, so quick survey. I'd just really love to hear, and you can click through this a little bit, Karen. Who is, oh, go back, sorry. Thanks, Ashley. Forgot Ashley's on this one. Quick survey, and we're gonna use emojis because I'm a proper millennial and I love emojis. Those people on the call that are all in on the threshold, give me a happy face or a thumbs up. Those that aren't sure, that seem to be having challenges or a lot of questions or concerns, give me a sad face or a thumbs down. And maybe you're here and you're not sure. You're just here for purely educational purposes. Pick an emoji that represents how you're feeling about the policy. I just want to understand who's on the line and how much information you have and how you're kind of feeling about this policy change so far. Will help me understand kind of what we're working with. So please be engaged. I really would appreciate it, everyone. Angry face. Wonder. I love that, Raylan. That's a wondering face and inquisitive. Awesome. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we really are going to dive in. I mentioned, I think we would be doing a disservice if we didn't give a little context of where we came from to get to where we are today. So Lucas, can you just give us a quick Public Assistance 101 for those attendees that may not be aware of what the Public Assistance Program is, explain the history of small, large project thresholds, why they matter so much, and then maybe touch on how we got to 2022 with this $1 million threshold and this big policy change.
Sure, happy to do that. I'm Lucas Pagan. So I'm going to establish a quick baseline here. Going to walk through the significance of the public assistance program, some of the basics there, a little bit of the history of the small project threshold, and then how we got to where we're at today. So if we can go into that next slide. So this slide shows the significance. Really, this top line, it's the single largest recovery grant program. And there are other grant programs out there, obviously, and it lists a few of them in the slide. But I think it's important to know that the significance when we talk in disaster recovery, we're usually referring to public assistance. And then there are other opportunities, funding opportunities that are established as a function of public assistance dollars. So directly related to a given disaster, you have HMGP, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. That's locked in based on the obligation dollars at a 12-month from the date. And then you have BRIC and FMA that are also established on a nationwide obligations for the year. So it's really significant, not just for this one program, but also the impact it has on other programs. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So this chart shows the kind of upward trend in public assistance dollars. You can see there's a bit of an overlay there with the COVID that's in green. So even if you see that as an outlier the last few years, kind of a black swan event, and every state and territory having a major disaster declaration, it was still trending upwards prior to. And this, a number of factors here, the frequency, the intensity of events, but also things cost more now. So the dollar trend goes up. So over the last 5 years, extreme weather's cost approximately $148 billion per year nationwide. So that is kind of where we're looking at and how much money this really comes into play each year. So we can go to the next slide, please. So back in 1988, the small project threshold was established at $35,000. So everything above $35,000 was considered a large project. And that was adjusted over time. And then more recently in 2015, it was adjusted to 120,000. So that would mean that things less than are small projects, things over, or I guess it would be $119,999.99. But that dollar figure changed. And then for a while, it continued on that same kind of slow upward trajectory, not by much, but in 2020, FEMA did a study that showed that 77% of projects were considered small projects. But if it was $1 million, it would adjust that to 94% of those projects. And FEMA's intent at the time is to sort of expedite the funding to the, not officially expedite, but it's a type of project, but to speed up the process and simplify the procedures to make sure that this funding hits the communities and the subrecipients quicker. So after that assessment, they did an adjustment with a simplified procedures to $1 million in 2022. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see what the Stafford Act change was. So 2022, they changed the Stafford Act and they increased the established project threshold for small projects to $1 million. This applies for every disaster declared on or after August 3rd, and the unobligated PA projects for emergency or for declarations declared between the 13th of March 2020, which would be your COVID declarations, up to that August 3rd date. So this is already impacting some disasters. Every state and territory, as I mentioned, has a declaration for COVID. So some of those unobligated projects fall into this small project threshold change. And this bullet point here just kind of indicates the intent behind it, which is to streamline or speed up the funding into impacted communities. So the next slide is a heat map. So this is showing the declarations since that change occurred. We do have an asterisk on California. That's including FMAGs and EMs. So kind of a bit of an outlier, but if the rest are major disaster declarations, you see Florida has had more than the rest, excluding California in this map. But this is kind of showing who has been impacted and who hasn't. So maybe your state hasn't, if you're from Louisiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, some of those states, you haven't seen a disaster declaration excluding those COVID. So you're maybe not quite sure how you're going to address these changes as you move forward. So we can go to the next slide. All right, so I talked about the small project threshold, and this, if you keep that in mind, you're thinking in two areas, there's small and large, but there's impacts to the types of projects we have. So we have 3 lanes for our projects when we develop them in public assistance. We have our completed lane, our standard lane, and our specialized lane. So if you split it into 2 groups, the completed lane, that's the work that's already done prior to FEMA conducting their scoping meeting or conducting their site inspections. The work's done, so you have final actual costs on that. Standard and specialized lanes are going to be based off of an estimate. And the difference between specialized and standard is there's some technical expertise required. So FEMA will provide some support and a different level of review to make sure that, a really complex bridge reconstruction project falls in that standardized lane where, a road washout might fall into the standard lane. So those are the differences, but really we want to think about estimates versus completed work and having actual costs, because that's really the distinction to be made between small and large projects. So if we move to that next slide, we can talk about the difference between small and large, keeping those lanes in mind. So small projects, you have all of your documentation in line, you know exactly what you spent to complete it, but you don't necessarily need to submit all that documentation to FEMA to get it obligated. And there's a different threshold between obligation and reimbursement, and that also is sort of varies from state to state as well, the reimbursement process. And we'll talk a little bit about FDM's response to this in a moment, but know that you have your, you claim your actual costs, and then there are limited options to change those projects once they're obligated for small projects. Large projects, you're estimating and you're going through the process to reconcile after the work is completed. So there can be variances in costs that are adjusted, and there's a little bit more documentation requirement to validate those actual costs. And that's really the main difference, is what does it take to get it written and obligated and closed out? And there's a greater requirement on the large projects, but there are adjustment opportunities. Small projects, less requirements, fewer adjustment opportunities. So this slide, I mentioned those adjustment opportunities for small projects. There are 8 of them identified here. Some of these are kind of adjust a bit to the negative. So if you didn't complete your scope of work, they can adjust that project down. So you didn't do the work, so they'll reduce it to 0 if you did none of the work. If there are fraud, waste, or abuse, those funds have to be taken back, so the scope and cost will be adjusted. If you're not in compliance with regulatory laws and regulations, then those cost items can be reduced as well. And when the insurance shows up and it's actually less than, more insurance, less than you expected, then you will then be adjusted down. But there are other times when there's a significant error or omission in the scope. There are damages that are not identified in the process. So you open it up, begin the work, and there's some hidden damage that wasn't identified in the scoping process. So those are some of the opportunities to change those small projects. Otherwise, you're dealing with a small project netting, which is an appeal process more or less, where you take all of the projects together. And that was referenced in the last slide. But you kind of pull all of your small projects costs and come to an actual reconciliation for all of your small projects, not just the one you want adjusted. And then you take the final cost for each of those. So that is the PA crash course baseline in a nutshell. Any questions in the chat about any of the things that we just ran over? Anyone want to ask something before we turn it right back over to Molly?
No questions in the chat quite yet.
Got it.
We'll just continue rolling.
Very cool.
So
Thanks,
awesome. Thanks, Lucas. So our next section, obviously that was a lot of information. We understand that, but hopefully that kind of sets the stage that we have come this far in the last 35 years. The program has continued to develop, but we have to operate within the confines of the CFR as far as large and small projects. So that's the baseline. Once this policy change came to effect in August, shortly thereafter, Hurricane Ian made landfall in Florida. So I do want to hand it over, and we can go to the next slide, over to Director Guthrie. Kevin, can you kind of set the stage for us here? Tell us about Hurricane Ian. Tell us how your state was impacted.
So specifically to this, Hurricane Ian, as you can see, those counties in the red hatched area were the most impacted counties by Hurricane Ian. Hurricane Ian to date has about 1,500 applicants. That was Hurricane Irma. 1,100 applicants for Hurricane Ian. overwhelming majority of those, I should say overwhelming majority, probably in the 30 percentile range, are houses of worship. So I say that now because I want to separate those two into two distinctly different categories, because I think this will make sense as we move on. Her state of Florida has traditionally had big storms, big impact areas, lots of applicants. Currently, we have about 27 open disasters. And our disasters are in the $1 billion range. Currently, Hurricane Ian is about $8.8 billion. So our cities and counties, our traditional applicants and subrecipients usually have a lot of experience at doing PWs and working through the PA process. There is some changeover at these cities and counties, but for the most part, they do have people that are experienced to this. What has really challenged us is since Hurricane Irma, and I believe we were the first. It may have been out with Harvey, but I believe with Irma, we became the very first state that had houses of worship that were eligible for public assistance. When that happened, we ran into an issue with people just not understanding public assistance and really not understanding how to do the process, especially in the procurement vein for houses of worship and 501c3s. So that is certainly the case here, with about 30% of the individuals applying for public assistance. Category B measures are houses of worship. So we'll go to the next slide, Karen. So what we did is we came up with a guide, enhanced small projects. As you can see here, the regulatory changes intended to expedite FEMA processing of the PA grant funding, the less stringent validation process associated with that, the risk of deobligation to both the state and subrecipients, that is in theory lower. I don't know that that's really theory versus reality, but nevertheless, that's why they're trying to do this. DEM has decided to implement the enhanced procedures to ensure that applicants are meeting the compliance requirements in areas like environmental and historic preservation, which again, we still have to comply with everything that we normally have to comply with. It's just that it has much less oversight. So as you can tell from the environmental and historical preservation, the insurance duplication of benefits vein, there's a lot of unknowns. So therefore, we have, again, put people into two different buckets. You'll see here down in the threshold, the effective dates there, you can read that for yourself, but the threshold there is DEM will have a enhanced small project checklist for all work to be completed under small projects with obligation amounts between $250,000 and $1 million, or $999,999. We've decided to not just stick with what FEMA's recommendations are. Again, federally supported, state managed. We have gone an extra step with an enhanced small project. So the documentation we have is an enhanced project checklist that is provided to all the subrecipients during the accuracy review process, which is an internal process for us once FEMA has awarded the project. We can go on to the next slide. So what happens at this point in time is sorry about that. You can't help technology. Somebody tried to call me. All right, so moving on. FDM staff will contact the subrecipient, discuss the checklist, go through that checklist with everybody. We can certainly provide a copy of the checklist. Plagiarism is the best form of flattery in this area, so please feel free to utilize this if it helps you. So the subrecipient and FDM staff discuss the checklist, review any compliance-related concerns or issues. The checklist must be completed by the subrecipient and returned to FDM prior to a payment being issued. Again, you can see it's a rather short checklist, but again, it helps us go through those things that may lead to deobligations. Subrecipients must ensure that they maintain the supporting documentation that demonstrates the costs were allowable in compliance with FEMA and state statute regulations for keeping those documents until what was actually occurred during that project period. Next slide. This page 2 of that enhanced small project checklist, subrecipients are responsible for maintaining compliance with the requirements specified in their subgrant agreements, including procurement, record retention, certification, like I just talked about on the record retention, certification, and reporting requirements. And then last, subrecipients with enhanced small projects that are work to be completed projects will be required by FDM to submit quarterly reports through the Florida PA program that we have. So we basically tried to get this down to 2 pages of a checklist. When you have multi-billion dollar disasters, and you have 1,500, 1,700, 1,100 applicants, if 30% of those, like they are in Hurricane Ian, are houses of worship that do not have any policies, any procedures, any procurement standards, that you can see where, if each one of them averages $750,000 and you have 300 of them, you can get into real money real quick. So that's one of the biggest reasons that Florida decided to go down this path of creating the enhanced small project checklist, and working with our partners to get them their money as fast as we possibly can. That's still the objective. Right now the division is paying out obligations about 160 days faster than we ever have before. That's part of other automation that we're doing and other recovery obligation standards that we have set forth in the last year and a half, 2 years. But again, we're moving faster than we ever have before. We still meet the intent of the small project threshold, which is to get that money out the door quicker. We're just making sure we're dotting our I's, crossing our T's, especially with applicants that are seriously high risk to the state of Florida. I think that's my last slide, but we'll double check, Karen. And yeah, so actually this is somewhat mine as well. So small projects, again, less than 250,000. That checklist will not be required on anything less than 250,000. When it gets into that next category of 250,000 to $1 million, this just puts it in a graph as what we just talked about. And then anything that is large, that still goes into its normal process that we have. Next slide. So for our recipients, are imposing procedures for small projects that are not required by FEMA, which could add the administrative burden that's on us, the recipient, the state level, which FEMA sought to reduce. I think you see where I'm going with this is we're allowed to make those procedures instead of pretty much following the FEMA guidelines, if you will, on regular normal projects. So we're creating more burden on ourselves, but we're certainly relieving some burden on the subrecipient. Moving over to the subrecipient side, we're trying to get, I know it says longer time to get a project obligated. We're certainly working on that as fast as we can, but we're still way ahead of schedule of where we have been in the past. The subrecipient is certainly having difficulties estimating small projects. We have seen that across the board in that they're not used to doing this. They're trying to do it for the first time, especially in the houses of worship nonprofit area. So that has certainly led to some increased timelines there. Continued difficulties in getting a certified engineer for those projects that are small, if needed. And then, of course, there's always a CRC backlog. Next slide.
Actually, could we park on that slide for a little while? I had a question I wanted to ask Molly. So the state of Florida is now 9 months into Hurricane Ian recovery, and you've been doing some work with some communities there, Molly. Do you feel like what you've seen kind of firsthand that people are recovering faster? And if so, how do you see that happening? And then if not, like what are the hurdles or challenges that they're seeing? Obviously, it's not a yes, no. So however you can explain what you're seeing would be helpful, I think.
Yeah. So we're definitely seeing a lot of these trends. Obviously, we're going to camp out on this slide for a little while because this is what we're seeing, right or wrong, right? When a new policy comes into play, there has to be response to it. There has to be adjustments. We learn and grow through new policies. And so what we are seeing is, and once again, I'm speaking on behalf of some communities that I'm working with, is is a hesitation. It's just a hesitation to write small projects based on estimates. Once again, that threshold, right? We're at 1 million. That used to be about Lucas, you brought it up, the 120 all the way up to almost 140. So when we wrote projects based on estimates in that 500,000 range, 750 range, which is fairly common, we felt comfortable with estimates because we knew that ultimately it would be adjusted and closed based on actual costs. We got really good at writing very good scopes of work. That's what we focused on much of my career, is getting an accurate scope of work, doing the work, doing the construction, and then ultimately getting it closed based on actual costs. But that's changed things a little bit. This policy now has us focusing on an accurate scope of work as well as an accurate cost. So to the point, to one of these bullets, I can say anecdotally, this is one of the communities is they're fearful, right? They know that it's not going to be $1 million. They know that it's going to be small, so they are hesitant. So a couple things are happening there. One, they're either wanting to do the work before writing the project. For those of us that are in the public assistance space, and if we have any of our FEMA partners on the line, obviously the goal is to get projects obligated. The goal is to get monies out for communities to recover. But maybe this has had a little bit of inadvertent effects and impacts in that it's slowing things down a little bit, because once again, they want to ensure they're going to get their costs reimbursed. And so yes, I have a couple that just purely are waiting. They're waiting to see what they spend to do the work. And then they're telling their PDMG or their program delivery manager, here's our actual costs, write it based on actuals. The second thing that's happening is there's a bit, once again, playing into the hesitation. They're wanting to go out to bid. They're wanting to get very solid estimates before committing to a project obligation. And so that's a huge pivot. And please, guys, in the chat, I'm going to be monitoring, and maybe you guys aren't sure, or you're thinking, even think back to prior disasters each of you were a part of, how this could come into play and how this could have changed things. Another thing that we are seeing is, I would say, we all know a period of performance for a disaster is typically 4 years. In Florida, much longer sometimes, 7, 8, 9. Right. And so whatever we commit to in that obligation for a small could end up being drastically incorrect. We're living in a time, of course, where materials are going up, cost of labor is going up. Things are just, imagine the disasters, the people that were in the middle of recovery when COVID happened, right? That changed everything for a couple of years. And so, yes, we're seeing some challenges, we're seeing issues, and ultimately I would argue a longer time to get projects obligated, just because there is that hesitancy, especially if they know that they're going to be smalls.
I think we should also remember, earlier in the presentation, we had our 3 lanes. 2 of those lanes are work to be completed or your estimates, and then there's the lane that is completed. I think, to Kevin's point, those are being obligated much quicker because the threshold to obligate a small project is less than a large project. So if you bump up that threshold, so you're kind of seeing it splits along 2 paths. There's the quicker path where the work is completed, and then, not in every case, but like Molly's saying, we have interactions with communities where they do have that hesitancy, where they're not quite sure how to nail down that estimate, or they don't have the highest level of confidence. So they're trying to see if they can kind of delay obligation until they get those firm numbers or actual numbers. So it's kind of both. It's achieving its goal while also elongating another part of it. So it's kind of interesting as we learn to navigate this policy change to kind of see it's really quick. This bucket fills up fast. We have money here in this bucket. I could see it in real time when the subrecipient asked questions of the PDMG about those. How do we adjust a small project? And we had that list, and about half of those were, this is how you adjust it down if you don't complete the scope of work, or if you don't do this. And there's very few instances in how you adjust it up. So knowing when that happens, that's the kind of push-pull that's happening, and that's what we've been seeing. But yeah, you're exactly right, Kevin, that we are seeing a lot of obligations really fast, but then you have this kind of holdout contingent that's kind of stringing out the long tail of recovery a little further into the future.
Lucas and Molly, I also think another issue that might be impacting that, especially for hesitancy's sake, is there may be a little bit of correlation to the 428 projects here as well, where they have done a lot of estimates and then they've seen that there's been problems with those estimates. And then there's this adverse reaction to do anything that's related to estimates and just go ahead and get the work done and then go and file it after the fact, if you will. So, and of course, that's not the intent of what's trying to be done here. We all get that. But I think, again, there may be a loose nexus, unintended consequence to some of the problems that we've had with the 428 program over the last, decade or so.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
That is a
Go ahead,
good point. And that definitely, I mean, I had this discussion with the community in the last couple of weeks. They said, if we get this project written, our current estimate is $600,000 to do the repair. And that's, 2023. And we have 10 projects. We can't do these all at once. We might be getting the money up front, but we just can't actually do all of the work. Our force account, we can't fix everything at once. And so what happens in 2025 when we're done and maybe it cost $850,000? And so that's a concern for me as these communities that are impacted, there's limited recourse for them to get that extra $250,000 that project cost. And so that is definitely playing into the hesitancy. Kevin, you brought up something that I did want to touch really quick is, of course, we want to get projects obligated quickly, but do you think needing to get projects, small projects written correctly has slowed down the project obligation time? Are you hearing that from your staff, that your subrecipients, your applicants are feeling that? And obviously the intention was to trust estimates, but where is that? Are you guys saying, hey, this is going to work, or what are you hearing?
Well, I mean, we're going through a lot of growing pains on this program, obviously, with Ian being our first really large disaster on this, and obviously disaster since the threshold. But they're working through through things as best they can, but at the same time, to your point, and I know you're dealing with a couple of our smaller fiscally constrained counties. There's just I think a general lack of understanding. And if they're going to put all of this work into a small project, should they just go ahead and go down the large project vein, especially if they're really close to that cusp, and just go ahead and that way, if they have to reversion the project, because to your point from your last statement, if that $800,000 small becomes a $1.1 million large because of the fact that price of goods and services has gone up and whatever else may be there, I think we've seen more of a tendency to be either A, hold out completely until they have a firm fixed price and it's done over, file it after the fact, or it's go down this traditional vein, because I believe we're going to run into A, cost overruns, B, we're going to run into goods and services increases in prices, and it's just hard for them to estimate. I mean, Florida has just about seen, Hurricane Michael, we were trying to be the poster child of the 428 process, because I do believe in the 428 process that there's a couple of flaws in it. I'd like to see a one-time adjustment at the point of sale. When I say point of sale, when you actually go to get the goods and services, the supply chain's caught up with you. I'd like to see that one-time adjustment. But now, fast forward 4 years later to Hurricane Ian, almost nobody's wanting to write 428 projects at all because of that very issue. I think the same thing's going to happen here with the smalls. I think people are just either going to simply wait, or they're either simply going to wait, or they're going to go to that large project.
Yeah, I'm even trying to think about how to cost or even estimate using force account labor and equipment. There's ways that we can cost and estimate if we know that it's going to go to a contractor or it's a bigger project. But even for force account, it's hard. It's a bit abstract, right? To think like, yes, 2 years from now, when we do this work, it's going to cost our public works staff this much, right? And that could be right in that $500,000 realm, give or take, maybe. But those are even a bit riskier to me as well. Gonna have to.
No, you're exactly right. And, depending on where you're at in the country, there's differences. And I know we're all looking at supply chain shortages, and we're all looking at labor shortages. We're all looking at contractual staff shortages and things of that nature. But, just with my own large construction project in our state EOC, we have had to downsize the building by almost 25% because of the budget. So in theory, if you do the math, our costs have gone up over 25% so that we can stay in budget and shrink our building. Same thing's happening here. If costs and supplies are going up, to your point, 2, 3, 4 years after the fact, you cannot project that. You can't project the cost of inflation. So, I mean, I think one thing I'd like to see change in the 428 program, and I think it would certainly apply here, is some type of cost for inflation rider that we could put on there. And then number 2 is, once you go to do the work, do a one-time offset. I would even further say, if today it's a small project and it's less than, say, I think 3/4 of the amount, $750,000, I think is a good place to go. If today it's less than $750,000, then the work's done in 2, 3, or 4 years, and there's a cost adjustment now that gets it just over that large project threshold, you still treat it as a small, because the intent was, at the time of the project scoping, it was a small. I'd like to see those 2 things come about. I think more people would then jump on it if they had some assurances of protections.
Yeah, I think that hesitancy is coming from just that, like knowing that you're close and you don't know exactly what your final cost will be. Because if you miss a $30,000 project by 20%, that's $6,000. But if you miss a $900,000 project by 20%, now you're out some significant cash. And so that cost escalation can still be there, but it's more impactful, especially to those communities that don't have as deep of pockets as like a larger state agency or a larger city or county. So it's really significant when you miss by that much. That's part of the hesitancy. Yes, that's a really good point. Also, I think it's worth now kind of, I guess, reminding folks that this isn't a persuasive exercise. We are talking about like the hurdles and constraints to this new policy, but it's not a pro or con. We do recognize the benefits of the streamlined process for those completed work projects, but the hesitancy or the constraints or the hurdles are coming from that sort of enhanced small project, as EFTA might be calling it. So just keep that in mind. This policy is here. This is what we're working with. So we're not trying to convince people it's bad policy. We just want people to be thinking ahead of how to, address these concerns when your community eventually has a major declaration.
Yeah, that's a good point. And typically, at least in the project formulation phase, we would try to get as correct as we could, right? As we have a process to follow. I'm not going to deep dive into all the acronyms on the front end of project formulation, but we have our damage descriptions. There's ways to get to a correct scope, but I think in the back of all of our minds, we always had, well, we can adjust it, right? We can fix it, and we can. That is one of the ways that if the scope is incorrect or something wasn't captured correctly in formulation, that is one of the ways that we can adjust projects. But I guess the people I've spoke with FEMA are really leaning into this small project netting theory, and we haven't really touched on that much, but that's basically a way to capture these overruns, in that we would analyze each individual small project and basically tally up all of the overruns. So that would mean looking at every single small project, and it goes through the FEMA appeal process. So it's an administrative process. It has timelines associated with it. But I think the backbone of this obviously is trying to get money up faster, and every state is doing what they can. And like Kevin spoke about, they're implementing some state specific kind of delivery nuance to try to get money out faster. But I think the heartbeat of this program this new policy, the streamlined policy, was on smalls. We're reducing the burden. Like, let's get money out faster on smalls. But we're still continuing to see some back and forth. One of the nuances within the policy, and maybe someone could drop the policy itself into the chat, that might be helpful. Maybe someone on our team, is that we were gonna really lean into certified engineering estimates. And not, once again, to Lucas's point, we're not here. This is just a discussion. We work very closely with FEMA. We understand how challenging their job is as well, the CRC, but these are just further hurdles, right, in the context of getting projects obligated, that We're still seeing some hesitation with accepting certified engineering estimates. We are. And then obviously the CRC backlog that is continuing to slow down the obligation. And so all of that is coming into play when we're talking about this $1 million threshold. And I think a call to action is, all of us trying to figure out how to make this work, right? It is great to get money out faster. That's what we want. We want to expedite recovery. And so maybe someone in the chat has seen this play out a little bit different. I'd love to hear that as well. But Lucas, I think you were going to hop on and add something.
Yeah,
too.
I was just going to piggyback on what you said about the small project netting. I think it still accomplishes one half of the intent. So it still expedites the funding to the communities. If you have 10 small projects and they are written based on estimates and they're obligated and those funds are dispersed as small projects, the funding still hits, even if it increases the administrative burden later to do an actual accounting and that small project netting. So it's not a total like, oh, well, this failed because like we're having to do a small project netting. It is still putting funding in the communities earlier than it would have if they were all large projects. That still takes longer. Then you have to go through the reimbursement and reconciliation process for each of those projects anyway. So it's not, I was kind of interested to hear you say that it does both of those things, and that's exactly right. So it's just something to think of. So it's not the end of the world. It's not, a disaster, but it is extra work. And then you have to figure out, like, you do your own cost benefit analysis there to see, is it worth it if I have an underrun on one project but the other are pretty close? Like, do you want to do that small project netting? Is it enough of an effort? And that's at the discretion of the community, obviously, and see if they want to go through that small project netting process to get those additional funds. So if you miss by quite a bit, it's obviously worth it. But if you miss a little bit, it might not be worth it. And it might depend on your community, what your financial situation is. Why are we seeing difficulties accepting engineering estimates? So it's not that they don't accept the estimate, as my understanding. It's that they still do a cost analysis to determine if the cost is reasonable. So if that CRC analyst determines that it's not a reasonable cost, it might be contrary to what the engineer that at the local level in Florida knows, that these are the material costs, these are whatever it is. Like, they know what the costs are, but there's a disagreement over whether those costs are reasonable. So they're not rubber stamping it. They're still doing a validation to determine if the costs are reasonable, and that's still creating a bit of a hang up at the CRC with accepting those stamped engineer estimates.
Yeah, and I'll just for that question, Lucas, I just want to add, we have had some issues, and again, not trying to beat anybody up about this, but you may have a mechanical engineer that provides a certified estimate in Fort Myers Beach, but when it gets to the CRC and it's looked at, it may be an electrical engineer that's looking at that. And that's one of the things that we've mentioned to the administrator in the past, is really at the CRC, making sure that we have the right people looking at the right stuff that's in their bailiwick and in their vein, because it does say a certified engineer. It doesn't necessarily say if it's electrical engineer, PE and ME, and so on and so forth. So that is something that Florida has seen a couple of times that have certainly impacted Mexico Beach. I know ACDC was their consultant in Mexico Beach and certainly had some problems with that. It wasn't until FEMA Administrator Deanne Griswold actually physically came out there herself and looked at it and understood the problem, and she immediately corrected it. But those are just issues we're having across the board when it comes to engineering certificates.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. That's exactly it. And so it ends up delaying the project, it adds a little bit of confusion, of course, those multiple layers, right? Anytime we add another layer into this process, it gets more complicated. But I do want to address too, because I do know we have a lot of people in the chat that maybe aren't in Florida. And so we did, thank you, Patrick, who dropped the new policy change in there. You'll see that the goal is a more streamlined approach, is reduced documentation requirements. It's a reduction of quarterly reports on smalls. It truly is an effort to get money out faster. And so when Kevin explained what they're doing, that's under, right? We have the federal umbrella, and then the states do have the authority to implement more strict or their own requirements. And so for those in different states, that's probably a conversation, if you're a community emergency manager or a county, a conversation to have with your states. Start having that conversation. Like, are you guys just going to follow what FEMA's saying? Because the policy itself does say basically that documentation won't be required for closeout, which is a big one. reconciling those costs is a big one for a lot of states, especially those states that do have state share, is what we're seeing. So have that conversation at the local level, start having those. I think that's very important, because from the front end, you're going to need to know what the expectation is, right? Do we need to make sure we are tracking? Of course, I would highly recommend always, of course, tracking your documentation, keeping everything organized. But I could see somebody perhaps reading the policy thinking, oh, I've got a bunch of smalls. I get the money now and I'm going to just fix it. And there's not really going to be any reconciliation at the end or things like that. So it's going to look different for every state.
That's a really good point. Yeah, it often happens that you think that to get to obligation, that's your only requirement. I've seen it over the years of subrecipients going, oh, well, we finished, we got the obligation, move on with my day, not knowing that there's a record retention requirement, making sure you actually have all the documents that you utilize to get that project obligated. And it should be that they probably never come up and you probably never need them again, but for those small projects anyway, but it's worth keeping them, not just worth keeping them. It's actually a grant condition and a requirement. So yeah, don't read too much into what to get obligated, but know what your requirements are as signing off on that grant.
And I think, Lucas, I'm actually glad you mentioned that point. In Florida, we're underneath the Florida Office of Inspector General. And this is why we've got some of these rules around this enhanced small project policy, if you will. And we have had multiple findings about risk-based analysis on the applicant themselves. And this retention that Lucas talked about, and just having the best policies and practices and procurements. We have been, the question just came in, as a retention policy federal? Yes, there is, but then Florida has additional requirements on top of that. So it's when we're dealing with applicants that are not used to doing this. And again, I keep coming back to houses of worship and nonprofits, because that's where a lot of our stuff ends up being, in this $1 million and less threshold. We just got to make sure that we're doing and complying with Florida State Statute 44.2 CFR, making sure all that's there. But again, Office of Inspector General has had numerous findings on the division on a lack of risk-based methodologies for FEMA programs. So again, that's why we have some of these procedures there to comply with also the Office of Inspector General at the state level.
Pop quiz time, Molly. I believe the federal requirement for record retention is 5 years. Can anyone correct me on that?
I don't want to say for sure.
Come on now.
Typically, our
yeah,
local.
I'm pretty sure it's 5 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think
we're less. So, but you have to go with the most strict, right?
Yeah, but I think what people need to realize, and again, that is correct, but I believe the terminology actually says, and I wish I had one of my people on, it's 5 years from the date of closeout of the disaster. So in Florida, Hurricane Andrew was closed out 26 years after landfall. So then it's 5 years after the disaster is completely closed out for the entire DR. It is not 5 years from when you closed it out.
That's correct. So you could be the first applicant that happens to be closed on a disaster, but as long as FDEM is still open as a grantee and the disaster has not been closed with FEMA, yeah, the clock hasn't started. So 26.
Yeah, I think the best practice is, now that records are generally digital, just keep them forever. Just don't lose them. That's what I always recommend. It's, keep them in perpetuity. Just put them in a hard drive somewhere and throw them in a box and label it Hurricane Ian 2023.
Yeah.
Or 22.
And Kevin, you actually brought something, and maybe people have questions about this. I don't want this threshold to be confusing in the context of procurement. It doesn't change any of the procurement requirements. So even if your projects are smalls, you still have to comply with all of the 2 CFR Part 200 requirements. So keep that in mind, that yes, money is flowing faster, but to Kevin's point with the enhanced small project, that's a big piece of this, is ensuring that procurement is still followed, because I could make up a number, but personally, the projects I've seen that have been deobligated, 95% of them are due to improper procurement. So we need to still get that right.
Yeah, and again, Molly, I know this isn't a Florida-centric thing, but talking about whatever your local policy is that's more restrictive. Again, here in Florida, we have yet another restriction here. If it is $34,999.99, That is a more restrictive policy that's in Florida State Statute 215. Therefore, that has to go to procurement. That is below the federal threshold, but we have to follow what's in 215, 216. And if a local organization has even more stringent on top of that, they have to go, well, what's the more stringent policy?
Thank you, Patrick. Patrick copy and pasted some really good information from the Papa G. And for those on the call that aren't, once again, in the PA space 100% of the time, the Papa G is the Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide. That is really going to be like 270 something pages. It's our full policy for the whole program. So if you really want to deep dive into PA, that's where I would have you start. But we can probably hop to the next slide. And if anyone has any questions, we'll recap first and then we will go to questions. So high level, really good discussion. And thank you for the participation in the chat. There was one thing someone said is that maybe we just have them cost it based on contractual costs, or maybe someone actually wrote me a message too, is just include a 20% buffer or something either way. So sounds like people are really thinking about how this could impact them. And we do know that it could be advantageous if work is completed when the project's written. I think that that's our big takeaway here is, and Lucas said it, is it's not good or bad. It just works differently for different types of projects. And so work is completed on a small, you're going to get your money a lot quicker. And so it is a benefit to those types of projects. It has still required the state of Florida, I don't want to speak on behalf of Kevin by any means, but to update their policies and procedures based on their own state statutes. And so it has reduced the administrative burden, not necessarily reduced the administrative burden to FDEM. So that's my shout out and my call to action for the other states on the line, is really start thinking this through in the context of your own personal state policies and procedures. And then lastly, hopefully the biggest takeaway is we still have so many questions from a project development level, coming from, boots on the ground, our PDMGs, all the way through the CRC, and then ultimately closeout. We're still a couple of years from closeout. So will we have enough documentation? Will things change even before then? So our next slide, we'll open it up for a couple minutes. If anyone has any last minute questions or last minute comments, Kevin or Lucas, feel free if you have anything you want to make sure to throw in.
I want to circle back to something you said, maybe like kind of beefing up your estimate a bit. There are obviously some ways that are acceptable to do that, but remember, it still goes through that cost validation process to ensure that the costs are reasonable. And then there's not necessarily a line item that's allowable for like just an extra buffer. So you have to think through how that's done. Not to say you're going to game the system entirely. I mean, you're going to get your eligible amount, and that will be determined cost reasonable or not. But it's certainly worth thinking about how you present that. And when you give it to the CRC, they won't just reject it and say, thanks, try again. They'll give you feedback, say like this line item or this lump sum doesn't work, or whatever the case may be. And you can refine your estimate, to kind of nail down the specificity needed for the CRC to review it and validate the cost, but also to make sure that you're not missing anything. So that it's a little bit of an iterative process. But yeah, it's definitely worth thinking through those things, the way you present your estimate and what the CRC will or will not be able to validate.
Karen, I think Karen and Ashley are still on the line.
Yep, we're here.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Molly. If there aren't any other questions, then I'd like to thank AC Disaster Consulting for supporting today's session, and Molly, Lucas, and Kevin for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you also to our great audience for participating. You can find out more about the NEMA Empowerment e-learning series and how to sponsor one of your own in the resources section of the NEMA website, www.nemaweb.org. Thank you again for attending. Stay well, and we hope to see you again soon. Have a productive rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.